Now that we've explored the print media and the radio, we're on to the next one, which is television. So in this video, we're going to first look at a little bit about political advertising. Now this pertains to both TV and the other sources, but a lot of this stuff happens on TV. So we're going to look at attack ads and campaign spending. We're also going to talk about this really important political debate, and that was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. It was the first televised debate, and I kind of want you to know a little bit about this debate as we go forward. We're also going to be looking at the president's role in addressing the public and rallying the public through using TV to talk directly to Americans. And then finally, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about who actually owns the media, this idea of media conglomerates. And that's what we're going to do next. So in terms of political advertising, let's imagine for a second that you wake up and let's say you live near LA Harbor College. So you get out of bed in the morning and you look down on the floor and you see that there is a stack of $1 bills on the floor. And weird enough, you look out the door and it's going right out the door of your bedroom. And it's going right out the door of your house. You walk outside and you look and you see that stack of dollar bills. Sure enough, it's going right down the street. So you and your friend, you get in the car, you want to see how far does this stack of dollar bills go? So before you know it, you're on the 5 freeway and you're driving through the Grapevine, and that stack of $1 bills is still going. In fact, you pull over in Bakersfield for lunch, get some gas in your car, keep driving, and hours later, you decide to switch with your friend up in Sacramento. So, now you're in the passenger seat, you take a little nap, you wake up, that stack of $1 bills is still outside. And about 9.5 hours later, after you got on the road, you're going to pull up to Mount Shasta, all the way up in Northern California, near the border with Oregon, 620 miles away. And you're going to see the end of that stack of money. Now, why did we do all that? That's how much money was spent on political advertising in 2020. You'd have a stack of $1 bills, 620 miles high. And so you've got $8.5 billion, billion with a B, that was spent in the 2020 election on advertising. So politicians and political action groups, they spend a lot. Why? They want to get their ideas out in front of people. And one of the ways that they do that is by buying ads on the radio, on TV. Maybe you're watching YouTube or Instagram and you've got this ad pop up about one of the candidates. Now, they spent a record number in 2020. A big part of that was because people were mostly in their house because of coronavirus. But every year, every presidential election, we see higher and higher spending in terms of trying to get people to vote for your candidate. And so there's some big money in this. And some of these TV stations during an election year, they'll make up to 10% of their profits just from political ads. Forget about all the other stuff, selling cars and trucks and medication and, home cleaning goods and all the stuff they sell on TV. Now, just from political ads, they're making like 10% of their budget sometimes during these election years. And when you actually look at the ads and the content of the ads, you have some that are kind of, hey, vote for me. This is all the great stuff I'm going to do for you. And you can count on me. Those are positive ads. But the vast majority of the ads that run, at least the majority of them, are negative ads. We call these ads attack ads. And the first one that ever happened was back in 1964. You had the president of the United States at that time, Lyndon Johnson, and he and his campaign ran the first negative attack ad in U.S. history. This ad is called the Daisy Girl ad, and it was 1964. 1964 was a pretty tense year in American history. We had a lot of civil unrest happening in cities across the country. Of course, there was a big push for civil rights that was happening. You had political assassinations that had happened. And you also had the country really thinking about the prospect of nuclear war, because we were not that far away from, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Americans really worried that they were going to be, struck by a nuclear weapon. So I'm going to show you this video of Lyndon Johnson and his Daisy Girl ad, and then I'll talk a little bit about it on the other side.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, two, one, zero. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So that was the famous Daisy Girl ad, and I gotta say, it's pretty intense. I mean, essentially the moral of the story is if you don't vote for me, your child is going to be destroyed in a nuclear explosion. So this was a pretty controversial ad when it aired. Lyndon Johnson did go on to win that election, so his opponent Barry Goldwater did not win. But over the years, this tactic of using a negative campaign ad, like the one we saw in the Daisy Girl ad, has increased over time. It's perceived as effective. You know, sometimes it's not just about getting votes for you. Sometimes it's also about making sure that your opponent, people don't go out to vote for them. So really kind of tarnishing their image. And we've seen this in recent elections as well. In the elections between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and Trump versus Joe Biden, there were a lot of negative ads that were ran on both sides of that campaign. So spending money on attack ads and campaign money on these ads, that's all one way of getting on TV and getting your message out. You can also use TV news coverage to your advantage sometimes when you're running for president. Now, Donald Trump famously did this in 2016 when he didn't actually spend as much money as some of the other candidates, but he would still get a lot of news coverage. And the way that he would do that is he'd say something shocking or controversial, or he would agree to go on to a news program. And, you know, he essentially got a lot of free airtime. And because he got that extra coverage, his profile grew and grew. And so while it does cost you money to advertise on TV, sometimes you can get that message out for free if you can get the news to cover you. So this is going to include when a politician goes on a news program, let's say like, you know, you're appearing on a news, being interviewed, or maybe you're going on a late night program. You can do that. Sometimes campaigns have even gone so far as to release sound bites. So they'll say something and they'll take a short clip and they'll give it to all the journalists, hoping that those journalists will report on it at the end of the day. So they can use these, you know, types of media coverage that you don't have to pay for. Now, one of the most important roles that the media plays, and especially television plays during the run-up to an election, is actually having a televised debate. Now, we're used to seeing this in recent years. So here you see Donald Trump and Joe Biden on the stage, and they're having a really heated debate right here. You can see they're pointing fingers and just the body language. You know, one of the reasons that people tune into these debates, first and foremost, they want to hear what are the ideas, what do the candidates stand for, and you want to learn about them and what they're going to do as president. But another thing too is you want to see how these people handle pressure. When they're under pressure, when they're being asked uncomfortable questions, how do they respond? And so Americans are tuning in and they're looking at things like the body language and the answers, all of this stuff. So I want to share with you a really important moment in American TV history when it comes to politics, and that's going to be the debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon back in 1960. And I think a picture is worth 1,000 words on this story. These are actually pictures taken from that debate. And on the left there, you've got John F. Kennedy. He looks pretty good, I'd say, in this picture. You know, he's looking healthy. He's looking young. You've got Richard Nixon there on the right-hand side. He's not looking quite as primetime ready, let's say. And so a little bit of the run-up to this debate is, you know, this was the first debate that ever appeared on TV. So it was going to be broadcast into people's homes all across the country. And for the last several weeks, JFK had been kind of touring around the country, out in the sunshine, meeting with voters. And Richard Nixon, unfortunately for him, got a really bad flu and he was sick and he was in bed actually for weeks coming up until this point. And so when it came to the time, he was still a little bit under the weather. Now, you also had this situation where, you know, TV was a new medium back then, and they asked the candidates if you'd like to wear makeup before you go on stage. And so JFK did the makeup. You know, he understood that there was going to be lighting and all of that. It would affect the way he looked. Richard Nixon said no makeup. Maybe he felt like it wasn't the most masculine thing he could do. So he denied the makeup. He said no. And so this really interesting thing happened where you had this phenomenon where people who were listening to the debate on the radio, a lot of them said, Richard Nixon crushed it. He did a really great job. Wow, did you hear what he said? He really won that debate. But then when you asked the voters who watched on TV, they said JFK won. And some of the reasons behind that is just the visual, the optics of it. When you're appearing on TV, people are looking at your body language. They're looking at how stressed out do you look. They're not just listening to your words. They're looking at all of these other nonverbal forms of communication. And so the really interesting thing about that debate is that it made the image of a presidential candidate even more important. So, having the right look maybe could be part of it, but also the way you look when you're under pressure. Like, do you look like you can handle the role as commander-in-chief and being president? So these televised debates, since the 1960s, there was a little bit of a gap between this one and the next ones that came. But for decades now, every president, as they're running for president, they go through these televised debates. And it's a great way for Americans to get a perspective. Here's a more recent picture where during the Democratic debates in 2020, you had Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and they had a real chance to differentiate themselves and talk to the voters about what they would stand for. And you could see how they would, respond under pressure. Another way that presidents have been able to use TV to their advantage has been to give an address from the White House. Now, before the internet, this was really important because, everybody was watching TV, and when the president spoke, nearly all of the TVs would switch over to what the president was saying. So it was a real opportunity to talk to everybody in the country. Now, all of our previous presidents in recent history, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, they have all had these speeches from the Oval Office or from the White House talking about something important. Obama, announcing the death of Osama bin Laden. Donald Trump talking about these COVID lockdowns, locking down for 2 weeks, right, to slow the spread of COVID. Joe Biden talking about the 1-year anniversary of COVID and really kind of getting the message out to the American people, talking to them directly, kind of in the same way that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did with the radio. Now, sometimes this can lead to a rally around the flag phenomenon. The best example of this is during George Bush's presidency when you had the 9/11 attacks. A lot of Americans really rallied around the nation and the president in particular, which made the approval ratings go way up. So sometimes when there's a time of national tragedy, sometimes the president's approval rating goes up when Americans try to come together and do what it takes to get through the situation. We've talked about a couple of important moments in U.S. history when it comes to TV. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is who actually owns the TV stations. There's a number of different styles and formats of TV. We've got cable, of course. We have local affiliate stations that are here in Los Angeles, like KTLA. And most of those media stations, they're going to be owned by bigger companies. And so we're going to call those companies, those corporations, conglomerates. A conglomerate is a corporation that's made up of a lot of different companies. Usually they can even be involved in doing different kind of things. So maybe it's not all media. They've got some other stuff going on as well. So today in America, you've got these 4 companies that essentially control most of the broadcast media in the United States. Most of the TV stations, most of the radio stations out there, and even some of the streaming platforms, they're owned by 4 major companies. So our book kind of gives this visual image. If you go back to 1983, you had 50 companies, that owned that 90% of the media. You fast forward until the 2020s, and you've got only 4 companies that really represent and own most of the TV, radio, and other broadcasting media. So we're going to take a look at 4 of these, but you're going to be familiar with the name Viacom, CBS, Disney, Comcast, Warner Brothers, Discovery. Let's take a look at Disney so we can understand what a conglomerate is. When you think about Disney, you might think about Mickey Mouse and Disneyland, but they own so much other stuff too. If you ever watch ESPN or ABC, National Geographic, Fox, anything out of Pixar, Marvel, any of the Star Wars stuff, even if you watch Hulu, they own a stake of that too. So Disney has their hands in so much of the media environment. Our textbook talks about some of the downsides of this, and one of the biggest concerns is when it comes to reporting accurately about problems in society, sometimes there's going to be a financial incentive for news agencies not to go after their own company. Let's say you work at ABC News and you get this breaking report about some scandal at Disney. are you likely to go and report on that scandal, knowing that Disney essentially is paying your bills and they're the ones that own the company? Probably not. And so there are some downsides to having all of this concentration. In addition to that, you're going to have a very small group of people making decisions about the kind of content that goes out on many, many, many different platforms and stations. So this isn't even a whole picture. You go into some of the other radio stations and so forth. There's a lot of other stuff that Disney owns that's not on here, but it gives you an idea that those four major corporations control a lot of the news media that's available for broadcast on TV and radio in the United States. So we're going to end it here. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about the role of the internet and its role in the media as well.